through the looking glass and what Alice saw there. Chapter 6, Humpty Dumpty. However, the egg only got larger and more human. When she came within a few yards of it, she saw that it had eyes, nose, and a mouth. And when she came up to it, she clearly saw that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. It can't be anyone else, she said to herself. I'm as certain of it as his name is written all over his face. It might have been written 100 times easily on that enormous face. Humpty Dumpty was sitting with his legs crossed like a Turk on the top of a high wall, with such narrow one that Alice quite wondered how she could keep his balance. And as his eyes were steadily fixed on the opposite direction, he didn't take the least notice of her. She thought he might be a stuffed figure after all. And how exactly like an egg is he? She said aloud, standing with her hands ready to catch him. For a great moment she was expecting him to fall. It's very provoking, Humpty Dumpty said after a long silence, looking away from Alice as he spoke, to be called an egg. Very. I said you looked like an egg, sir, Alice gently explained. As some eggs are very pretty, you know, she added, hoping to turn the remark into some sort of compliment. Some people, Dumpty said, looking away from her as usual, have no more sense than a baby. Alice did not know what to say to this. It wasn't at all like conversation, she thought, as he never said anything to her. In fact, the last remark was evidently addressed to a tree. So she stood there and softly repeated to herself, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty in his place again. And the last line is much too long for the poetry, she added almost out loud, forgetting that Humpty Dumpty would hear her. Don't stand there chattering yourself like that, Humpty Dumpty said, looking for the first time, and tell me your name and your business. My name is Alice, but that's a stupid enough name, Humpty Dumpty interrupted quite patiently. What does it mean? Must a name mean something? Alice asked doubtfully. Of course it must, Humpty Dumpty said, with a sort of laugh. My name means the shape I am, and a very handsome, good shape it is, too. With a name like yours, you might be any shape almost. Why do you sit here all alone? Asked Alice, not wishing to begin an argument. Why, because there's no one with me, cried Humpty Dumpty. Did you think I didn't know the answer to that? Ask another. Don't you think you'd be safer down here on the ground? Alice went on, not with any idea of making another riddle, but simply in her good-natured anxiety for the queer creature. That wall is so very narrow. What tremendously easy riddles you ask, Humpty Dumpty growled out. Of course I don't think so. What if ever I did fall off, which there's no chance of, but if I did, he pursed his lips together and he looked so solemn and grand that Alice could hardly help but start laughing. If I did fall, he went on, the king has promised me. Ah, you might turn pale if you like. You didn't think that I was going to say that, did you? The king has promised me with his very own mouth to send all his horses and all his men, Alice answered rather unwisely. Now, I declare that's too bad, Humpty Dumpty cried, breaking into sudden passion. You've been listening at doors and behind trees and down chimneys. You couldn't have known it. I haven't, indeed, Alice said very gently. It's in a book. Ah, well, they may write such things in a book, Humpty Dumpty said in a clear, calmer tone. That's what you call a history of England, that is. Now, take a good look at me. I'm the one who has spoken to the king. I am. Mayhap you'll never have seen such another. To show you that I'm not proud, you may shake my hands with me. And he grinned almost from ear to ear as he leant forward and as nearly as possible fell off the wall in doing so, and offered Alice his hand. She watched him a little anxiously as she took it, and if he smiled much more, the ends of his mouth might meet behind, she thought. And then I don't know what could happen to his head. I'm afraid it would just come off. Yes, all the king's horses and all his men, Humpty Dumpty went on. They'd pick me up again in a moment, they would. However, conversation is going a little too fast. Let's go back to remark on the last one a little bit. I'm afraid I can't quite remember it, Alice said very politely. In case that we start afresh, said Humpty Dumpty, and it's my turn to choose the subject. He talks about it just as he would a game, thought Alice. So here's a question for you. How old did you say you were? Alice made a short calculation. 7 years and 6 months. Wrong, Humpty Dumpty exclaimed triumphantly. You never said a word like it. I thought you meant, how old are you? Alice explained. If I'd meant that, I'd have said it, said Humpty Dumpty. Alice didn't want to begin another argument, so she said nothing. 7 years and 6 months, Humpty Dumpty repeated thoughtfully. An uncomfortable sort of age. Now, if you'd asked my advice, I'd have said, leave it off at 7. But it's too late now. Oh, I never asked advice about growing, Alice said indignantly. Too proud? The other inquired. Alice felt even more indignant at this suggestion. I mean, she said, that one can't help growing older. One can't, perhaps, said Humpty Dumpty, but two can. With proper assistance, you might have just left it off at 7. What a beautiful belt you've got on, Alice suddenly remarked. They had had quite enough of the subject of age, she thought, and it was really, if they were really taking turns now in choosing the subject, it was her turn now. At least she corrected herself on second thoughts. A beautiful cravat, I should have said. No, a belt, I mean. I beg your pardon, she added in dismay, for Humpty Dumpty looked thoroughly offended and began to wish she hadn't chosen the subject. If only I knew, she thought to herself, which was the neck and which was the waist. Evidently Humpty Dumpty was very angry, though he said nothing for a minute or two, and when he did speak it was in a sharp growl. It is a most provoking thing, he at last said, when a person doesn't know a cravat from a belt. I know it's very ignorant of me, said Alice in a humble tone that Humpty Dumpty so that Humpty Dumpty relented. It's a beautiful cravat, child, a beautiful one, as you say. It was a present from the White King and Queen. There now. Is it really? Alice said, quite pleased to have found that she had chosen a good subject after all. They gave it to me, Humpty Dumpty continued thoughtfully, as he crossed one knee over the other and clapped his hand around it, then gave it to me for my unbirthday present. I beg your pardon, Alice said with a puzzled air. I'm not offended, said Humpty Dumpty. I mean, it was an unbirthday present. A present given when it isn't your birthday, of course? Alice considered a little and said, I like birthday presents best, she said at last. You don't know what you're talking about, cried Humpty Dumpty. How many days are there in the year? 365, said Alice. How many birthdays do you have? 1. And if you take 1 from 365, what remains? 364, of course. Humpty Dumpty looked doubtful. I'd rather see it done on paper, he said. Alice couldn't help smiling, and she took out her memorandum book and worked out the sum. 365 minus 364 equals 365 minus 1 equals 364. Humpty Dumpty took the book and looked at it carefully. That does seem to be done right, he began. You're holding it upside down, Alice interrupted. To be sure I was, said Humpty Dumpty gaily as she turned it round for him. I thought it looked a little queer. As I'm saying, that seems to be done right, though I haven't time to look it over thoroughly just now. And that shows there are 364 days when you might get an unbirthday present. Certainly, said Alice, and only 1 day for birthday presents, you know. There's glory for you. I don't know what you mean by glory, Alice said, and Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant it's a nice knockdown argument for you. But glory doesn't mean have a nice knockdown argument, Alice objected. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more, neither less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question, said Humpty Dumpty, is which is to be master. That's all. Alice was too much puzzled to say anything, and so after a moment Humpty Dumpty began. They have a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest. Adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can manage a whole lot of them, impenetrably. That's what I say. Would you tell me, please, said Alice, what that means? Now you talk like a reasonable child, said Humpty Dumpty, looking very much pleased. I meant by impenetrably that we've enough of this subject, and it would be just as well that you'd mention what you mean to do next, as I suppose you don't mean to stop here for all the rest of your life. That's a great deal to make one word mean, said Alice in a thoughtful tone. When I make a word do a lot of work, like that, Humpty Dumpty says, I always pay it extra. Oh, said Alice. She was too much puzzled to make any other remark. And you should see him come round to me on a Saturday night, Humpty Dumpty said, wagging his head gravely from side to side for them to get their wages, you know. Alice didn't venture to ask what he paid them with, and so, you see, I can't tell you. You seem very clever at explaining words, said Sir, said Alice. Would you kindly tell me the meaning of the poem called Jabberwocky? Let's hear it, said Humpty Dumpty. I can explain all the poems that ever were invented, and a good many that haven't been invented just yet. This sounded very hopeful, so Alice repeated the first verse. 'Twas brillig in the slithy toves, did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the moonraths outgrabe. That's enough to begin with, Humpty Dumpty interrupted. There's plenty of hard words there. Brillig means 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the time when you begin broiling for your things for your supper. Well, that's all very well, said Alice. And slithy? Well, slithy means little and slimy. Lithe is the same as active. See, you see, it's kind of a portmanteau. There are two meanings packed up into one word. I see now, said Alice, and she remarked thoughtfully, what are toves? Well, toves are something like badgers. There's something like lizards, and there's something like a corkscrew. They must be very curious looking creatures. That they are, said Humpty Dumpty, and they make their nests under a sundial, and they live on cheese. And what's a gyre and to gimble? To gyre is to go round and round like a gyroscope, and to gimble is to make holes in a gimlet. And the wabe is the grass pot round the sundial, I suppose, said Alice, surprised at her own ingenuity. Of course it is. It's called a it's called weeb because, you know, it goes a long way before it and a long way behind it and a long way beyond it on each side, Alice added. Exactly so. Well, then, mimsy is flimsy and miserable. And there's another portmanteau for you. And a borogrove is a thin, shabby-looking bird with its feathers sticking all around, and it's something like a live mop. And what are moonraths? Said Alice. I'm afraid I'm giving you a great deal of trouble. Well, a rath is a sort of green pig, but mome, I'm not certain about that. I think it's short for home, meaning that they've lost their way, you know. And what does outgrabe mean? Well, outgripping is something between bellowing and whistling. It's a kind of sneeze in the middle. However, you'll hear it done, or maybe down the wood yonder. And when you've heard it once, you'll be quite content. Who's been repeating all this hard stuff to you? I read it in a book, said Alice, but I had some poetry repeated to me that was much easier than by Tweedledee, I think it was. As to poetry, you know, said Humpty Dumpty, stretching out one of his great hands, I can repeat poetry as well as other folks. It comes to that. And oh, you needn't come to that, Alice said hastily, hoping to keep him from beginning. The piece I'm going to repeat, he went on without her noticing his remark, was written entirely for your amusement. Alice felt that in this case she really ought to listen to it, so she sat down and said, Thank you, rather sadly. In winter, when the fields are white, I sing this song for your delight. Only I don't sing it, he added with an explanation. I see you don't, said Alice. If you can see whether I'm singing or not, you've sharper eyes than most, said Humpty Dumpty. And Alice was silent. In spring, when the woods are getting green, I'll try and tell you what I mean. Thank you very much, said Alice. In summer, when the days are long, perhaps you'll understand the song. In autumn, when the leaves are brown, take pen and ink and write it down. I will if I can remember it. So long, said Alice. You needn't go on making remarks like that, Humpty Dumpty said. They're not sensible, and they put me out. I sent a message to a fish. I told him, this is what I wish. And the little fishes of the sea, they sent an answer back to me. The little fisher's answer was, we cannot do it, sir, because... I'm afraid I don't quite understand, said Alice. It gets easier further on, Humpty Dumpty replied. I sent them again to say it will be better to obey. The fishes answered with a grin, why, what a temper that you are in. I told them once, I told them twice. They would not listen to advice. I took a kettle, large and new, fit for the deed I had to do. My heart went to hop, and my heart went to thump, and I filled the kettle at the pump. And then one comes to me and said, the little fishes are in bed. I said to him, I said it plain, then you must wake them up again. I said it very loud and clear. I went and shouted in his ear. Humpty Dumpty raised his voice almost to a scream and repeated this verse, and Alice thought with a shudder, I wouldn't have been a messenger for anything. But he was very stiff and proud. He said, you needn't shout so loud. And he was very proud and stiff and said, I'll go and wake them if. I took a corkscrew from the shelf. I went and waked them up myself. And when I found the door was locked, I pulled and pushed and kicked and knocked. And when I found the door was shut, I tried to turn the handle, but there was a long pause. Is that all? Alice asked timidly. That's all. Goodbye. This was rather sudden, Alice thought. After a very strong hint that she ought to be going, she felt it would be hardly civil to stay, so she got up and held out her hand. Goodbye, until we meet again, she said as cheerfully as she could. I shouldn't know you again if we did meet, Humpty Dumpty replied in a discontented tone, giving her one of his fingers to shake. You're so exactly like other people. The face is what one goes by generally, Alice remarked in a thoughtful tone. That's just what I complain of, said Humpty Dumpty. Your face is so the same as everybody. It has two eyes, so marking their place with the air in his thumb, a nose, a mouth under. It's always the same. Now, if you had two eyes on the same side of your nose, for instance, or a mouth at the top, that would be some help. It wouldn't look very nice, Alice objected, but Humpty Dumpty only shut his eyes and said, wait till you've tried it. Alice waited a minute to see if he would speak again, but he never once opened his eyes and took any further notice of her, so she said goodbye once more, and getting no answer to this, she quietly walked away. But she couldn't help saying to herself as she went, of all the unsatisfactory, she repeated this aloud as if it was a great comfort.